representation and skilled in second language learners and proficient bilinguals, from the book Cognitive Aspects of Bilingualism. The first aspect that is mentioned in this book is talking about skilled bilinguals. And so talking about them, the attainment of proficiency is constrained by three factors. The first one is the age at which L2 exposure occurs. So this means the age in which you are learning the language. The younger the learner is, the better. And the second one is the degree of transfer from the first language, L1 to L2. And the L1 is the mother tongue, and the L2 the foreign language that the person is learning. And the third one is the context of acquisition. This means the reason why the person is learning the language and the place. The second aspect is the competition for selection. And in this one, the proficient bilinguals, as everybody knows, may be particularly expert in executing the control that is required to accomplish skilled performance in the presence of potential competition. And this discussion will be focused on skilled at the level of lexical access, because this is the context in which there has been the greatest research activity. So this is important to know that when you are skilled and when you are proficient at speaking or are using a language, you are going to be competitive at doing it, and you are going to have all the cognitive resources that you need for doing it. But what happens when you are an adult and you want to develop proficiency? So we're going to see some research based on this aspect. And adults mediate through the L1, but the proficient users are the ones who are able to use L2 independently. So this means that you are not thinking about the first language, you are using the second language or the foreign language, and you can come up with all the ideas and you can express your ideas. The psycholinguistic research concludes that translation is faster than picture naming. So they show different activities, translation activities and picture naming activities, and they realize that translation is faster, maybe because it's linguistic and you just get the linguistic resources, and it's better than picture naming. The direct word associations between L1 and L2 were not active, even if they are translating. They don't have one word in Spanish and one word in English to say the same object or to name the same object. And low level of proficiency learners were faster to translate into the L2 than to name pictures in the L2. So everybody knows that translation is easier than picture naming, and once that you are getting a better level, you are improving your abilities to speak and to get the meanings of the words without using translation, just associating the word to a picture. And finally, at higher levels, the translation and picture naming performance was similar. So you can have the two paths. You can translate or you can point at an object. So those are the options that a person that is a proficient user can have to express themselves. Besides the previous experiment, there are more. The first one that I'm going to talk about is to show words, one word in English and another one in Spanish, and the words are not the exact translation, but they are similar. The second experiment was cognates, and a cognate is a word that derived from the same word in an ancestral language, for example, Latin or Greek. And the third experiment was word neighbors, and these word neighbors are activated even when the task is performed in one language alone, even if this language is not the native one. So they are words that are similar, and they are activated when you are using a word. Now I am going to talk about models. The first model is the Crowell's Tour that was in 1994, and this is a model that is hierarchical, and it says that at the lexical level, L2 is associated to its translation, and lexical representations of the two languages are functionally independent. As learners become more proficient in L2, the word-to-word concept links become stronger, and the L2 can be processed without access to the translation in the L1 production. The second model presented in this article is the Dijkstra van Heuven that was made in 1988, and it's about the bilingual interference activation. And they said that the bilingual lexicon is integrated and that accesses the language and is not selective. And it is assumed that the activity of the L1 involves different representations in L2 production and comprehension. So here we have two different processes, and the process of production is a top-down process, and it says that the activation of meaning is related to alternatives, and the translation is included. And the second one is related to the comprehension, and the nature of it is the bottom-up. It will engage from relatives at the level of orthography and phonology of a word that are read or spoken. So they are looking for different relatives or words that are similar, just to get to comprehend what people, or to understand what people are saying. The third model is the Sunderman and Crowell, and this says that proficient learners were sensitive only to the direct lexicon form relatives and not to the distractors that resemble the translation equivalent. And L1 diminishes as learners achieve greater skill in the L2, but that activity is restricted to the reliance on the translation equivalent. And now I'm going to talk about developing of automaticity and the inhibitory control in L2. And the first one is automaticity, and learners typically become faster in processing the L2 as they become more proficient. They are going to understand it better and faster because they are using the language and they develop their skills at understanding the language. For Segalowitz and Holzkirchen in 2005, the automaticity is related to different aspects. The first one is processing is fast, as I said before, requires little or no attentional effort, and occurs outside of conscious awareness. So you are not conscious, or you are not focusing on the comprehension of the language, because this is automatically done, and it cannot be stopped once it had been initiated. Now I am going to talk about inhibitory control, and this means that even proficient bilinguals are unable to switch off one of their languages alone. Green in 1998 said that the inhibitory control embeds the bilingual lexicon in a complex system of cognitive control mechanisms that serve to focus attention on the task to be performed and to reactively inhibit the representations not to be produced. So this means that even if you're speaking Spanish or English, and no matter which one is your second language, you are not going to totally inhibit, if I want to say, the native language. Besides that, once a high level of proficiency is achieved, active inhibition of the unseen language is not required. Inhibition of the L1 may be necessary to enable production in L2. L1 is normally active during planning of L2 because maybe you don't have many resources, and this aspect is more probably to be occurred in when you are using the L2 and when you are at a low level. And finally, speech must be inhibited. And finally, the more cognitive and attentional resources, the more acquisition and performance in L2. This means that using more cognitive and attentional resources will guarantee that the acquisition and performance in L2 will be better. And speaking in L2 under formal circumstances is mentally exhausting, and this is why you are going to look for words that they are used at a high level, and when you try to find them, maybe at a lecture or when you are having a presentation, that is going to be pretty exhausting, because finding the correct word that you need to use for developing or for expressing yourself, that would be a little bit tough when you don't have enough vocabulary according to the register that you are using at the moment of speaking. Continuing with this presentation, I am going to talk about the studies, and the first study is a cognate susceptibility in L2 learners. And differences of proficiency in French, word naming and word translation, and it was assessed the role of memory resources in modulating the L2 skill, the effects of span on translation performance when the words to be translated were cognates or not, they were similar or from the same primitive family. And bilinguals are typically faster to translate cognates than match not cognates target words. And finally, sharing lexical forms is not a reliable cue to translation. The second study is called Errors in Spoken Translation, and the aim of this was to examine errors that learners make in attempting to translate words. And Tokowicz et al. 2004 were interested in the types of errors made when translated L2 performance, and more specifically working memory capacity and study abroad experience. So these ones were the variables. And native in English and Spanish as L2, some of them have spent a substantial amount of time studying abroad, 15 months or more, and the other ones less, 8 months or less. The first trial is related to the participants provide a translation of a semantically related word instead of the target translation, and the second trial was the participant does not produce a translation, and this was a non-response error. The conclusions of this study were that more non-response errors than meaning errors were made, and when the participants don't know, they prefer not to answer, but they were like the ones that were at a low level. And when the participants lived abroad, they prefer to error. This is due to the abroad environment encouraged them to attempt to communicate as much as possible, but only the learners with the sufficient memory resources are able to get an approximate translation because of the amount of information that must be maintained in the memory. So this is not just to live in another country. Well, this is a matter sometimes of it. This is to get the enough resources, well, cognitive resources and memory resources to get the vocabulary that you are learning in in another context. The third study is one that was made by Link and Kroll in 2005, and they tested participants who were native in English, and this means that they are English speakers learning Spanish, either or without a study abroad experience. And so they classified them into two groups. The first one was the immersed learners, and they were tested while studying. And the second one was the classroom learners, same level of a university Spanish courses, but have no previous experience abroad. And the task was the translation recognition, and L2 word was presented followed by an L1 word, for example, cara and face. The participant was instructed to decide whether the second word was a correct translation of the first word and respond by pressing a button immediately. The button was marked with yes or no. They also had some instructors, and those instructors were related to the target translation. For example, face, nose, and you know that nose is a part of the face. At early stages L2 acquisition, learners are more susceptible to interference from lexical relatives in the L1 that resemble the translation equivalent. The immersed learners process the L2 words in a more conceptual manner. This is basically they are getting the words from the context, and the classroom learners with higher working memory perform very similarly to the immersed learners with lower working memory. When you are learning a language at an institution, you need to have your memory pretty activated, because you are memorizing the words, you are getting the vocabulary from the class, from the teacher, from the book, from different resources. But when you are immersed in the context, you are exposed to the language at any moment. And the study abroad and great memory are valuable in L2 learner. So it is not just having a good memory, or it is not just living abroad, is to have a mixture between the study abroad and the working memory or a great memory. The fourth study is related to does memory span modulate parallel activation of the two languages in a word recognition task, and this was answered by Dijkstra et al. In 1998, and it showed that Dutch-English bilinguals were slower to perform the lexical decisions task in English when the words were interlingual homowords. The translation task was related to showing that bilinguals were faster when they had higher rather than lower memory span. Bilinguals with higher span were unable to avoid the cross-language activation and competition that occur when these languages ambiguous were presented. And finally, the alternatives in each of the bilinguals two languages appeared to be outside cognitive control processes. And to end up with the studies, the fifth one is cognitive consequences of bilingualism. The performance of both L2 learners and high proficient bilinguals is modulated by available cognitive resources that effectively direct attentional mechanisms to allow L2 skills to develop that inhibit. Bilinguals are superior to monolinguals on tasks that require irrelevant information to be ignored. This is why they spend a lifetime sharpening a set of cognitive skills that specifically function to reduce competition across their two languages. So they are fighting with themselves, trying to get the correct words that are needed to express themselves. And a lifetime of bilingualism provides a degree of protection against the normal effects of aging. and as your memory is working and getting new words and new resources, the effects of aging are going to be a little bit slower than in a normal person. And finally, the conclusions of this chapter are related to the goal, and the goal was to provide a brief review of the psycholinguistic studies that have examined the cognitive basis of L2 learning and proficient bilinguals performance. And it said that successful attainment of L2 skills relates on cognitive support in addition to the development of linguistic representations. Bilingualism has consequences for both brain mechanisms and architecture, and the last conclusion is that research on bilingualism provides an important tool for investigating the constraints of plasticity of cognitive neural systems. And this was all about this chapter on bilingualism and how to be proficient at a second language.